everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and today I'm here to discuss all of the books that I read in December. So December felt like a chaotic reading month for me, but actually it was a really good reading month. I managed to read a lot of books, some of which have faded a bit since I read them, but I will do my best to tell you about these books and what I thought of them. So the first book that I finished in December was an ebook ARC that I received from NetGalley, which was called I'm Not Charlotte Lucas by Casey Stockton. And this was a modern romance book based around the premise that this young woman is named Charlotte Lucas, but she goes by Charlie. And she is beginning to feel a lot like Pride and Prejudice's Charlotte Lucas. She's 27, has had no luck in love, has had to move back in with her parents, and she just feels like a failure. Then, of course, we have the romance trope of her elderly neighbor has a grandson who's just broken up with his girlfriend and needs a date to go to the gala with. So would Charlie go with him? And you can see where that's going to go right away. What I loved was that all of the conversation felt really realistic. These characters had really good communication for a romance novel, especially towards the end. They were very open and honest with how they were feeling, what they needed. It was very refreshing. So I wouldn't say it was one of the best books that I read this month, but it was really cute and refreshing. Then I finished The Foundling by Stacey Halls. This was the last Stacey Halls that I had not read yet, and it was wonderful. This is the story of a young woman who has a child out of wedlock. She cannot afford to keep the baby right now, since in 1754, I want to say. So she brings her daughter to a foundling hospital on the understanding that when she has enough money, she will come back and collect her. So several years later, she goes back to pick up her daughter and discovers that someone using her name and knowing things that only she could know picked up her daughter the day after she dropped her off. And so now she is off on a quest to find out who adopted her daughter and how can she get her back. This book was terrifying and yet brilliant. You felt for every single character. She highlighted the pitfalls of life for both the wealthy and the poor in the 18th century. She highlighted what it was like for people of color in London in the 18th century. She dealt with mental illness, I think, really brilliantly, and with alcoholism. There were so many twists and turns, but it was so wonderfully done. I would really highly recommend this. Then I read The Bookshop by Penelope Fitzgerald, which I think my mother is borrowing at the moment. And this is about a young woman in the 1950s, it's definitely post-war England, who moves to this very small town and buys this house to convert it into a bookshop, and everything that happens in the town because of it. It was very slow-paced, very much character-driven. It's very short as well. I got through it on a train ride. There was so much that was really wonderful about it. I just don't know about the ending. The ending really undercut everything that it was doing really well for me. So if you have also read it, I would love to hear your thoughts down below, but that's about as much as I can say without giving away any spoilers for the ending of the book. I then finished 2 audiobooks. The first was The Christmas Hirelings by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. And I listened to the Audible version, which is narrated by Richard Armitage, which I have to say was the big draw for me. Initially, at least, that was the big draw. Now, however, I have read some Mary Elizabeth Braddon. I read Lady Audley's Secret last Victober, the Victober of 2021. And so I was intrigued to see where this was going to go, because I knew it was going to be very different in tone, and indeed it was. It's the story of this old man and two of his friends who are also adults, living in a Cornish manor house in the Victorian era. Sir John doesn't see the point of Christmas anymore. He's grown very cynical and very blasé about it. And so they come up with the idea of, well, if there are children in the house, Christmas gets to be that much more special. So his friend says, wait, I know 3 children. I'll go out and bring them home. And then you also get the story of Sir John's 2 daughters, and find out that one of them has died and the other is estranged from him. And then these children arrive, and they start winning all the adults over, and Christmas magic starts to happen. And I figured out pretty quickly where this was all heading. But it was really wonderful to see something very sweet, to see something that treated these children like mini adults. Except for the classism, I really, really enjoyed it. And the classism is typical of the Victorian era, so it became almost funny. I would say this was like a good Hallmark Christmas movie, and that you saw exactly where it was going. It could get a little bit saccharine at times, but ultimately very well done. I then also listened to 84 Charing Cross Road by Helene Hanff. This has been recommended to me by a number of subscribers. Some of you even wanted to send me a copy, which is just so sweet and generous of you. However, I live in a very small town. I cannot afford a P.O. box. So just for safety reasons, I have nowhere for you to send it right now. But I was able to listen to this audiobook, and it was really sweet, and I did enjoy it. I am extra intrigued to read The Duchess of Bloomsbury Street to see where this story is going to go next, because it ended on such a final note. I can't imagine where that one is going to go, but I know the two are linked somehow. If you're unfamiliar, 84 Charing Cross Road is a collection of real letters between Helene Hanff and the employees of a bookstore at number 84 Charing Cross Road in London over the course of 10 or 20 years post World War II. Then on December 16th, in honor of Jane Austen's birthday, I read Jane Austen, The Chaunton Letters, which were edited by Catherine Sutherland. I have a complete edition of Jane Austen's letters, but these were specifically ones written around the time that she was living in Chaunton House and at pivotal moments in her time living there. And what I loved about this were the notes and the extra information that Catherine Sutherland puts in. She gives you a timeline of Chaunton House itself, not just Jane Austen's own life. Before every letter, she gives you almost a glossary of terms, people that Austen references that mean different things now, or that modern readers might not necessarily know of or understand. And that was brilliant. I think she should edit the next batch of Jane Austen's letters in total. But that is not a decision for me to make. But this was a wonderful way to revisit my favorite author. I then finished The Fencing Master by Arturo Perez-Reverte, and this was translated by Margaret Jewel Costa. And the premise of this sounded amazing. It's about a fencing master in the 1860s in Madrid, I believe, who on the one hand is getting older himself and having to come to terms with that and what it means for his career and how he defines himself as a person. He also has to come to terms with the modern era and modern warfare, and dueling is leaning more towards guns than swords, and what does that mean for honor and chivalry and warfare and all of those things. Then on the other hand, this mysterious woman comes to him and wants to learn this particular thrust that would be almost, if not impossible, to defend against. That to me sounded fantastic. However, the way it was written, I didn't really love it. Part of it could have been the character in terms of Don Jaime is very old-fashioned, very chivalric, so teaching a woman is something that he has never considered. He really has to work through himself to become comfortable with that, which I could almost see. But then at the same time, it felt very male-gazy. I also understand that this mysterious woman is trying to play her cards close to her chest. She's not giving much away, but neither is he asking very much. He's not really trying to get to know her. He's just watching her and lusting after her from afar, which is very uncomfortable. And the ending, I don't know where that ending came from, but it still makes me uncomfortable to think about. So, as exciting as the premise was, I did not love how it was executed, sadly. I then read an arc of Lies We Sing to the Sea by the author's name escapes me. And this is sort of a Greek myth retelling, or rather, it's a Greek myth continuation. And we go to Ithaca, home of Odysseus, a few generations after the end of the Odyssey. And it has become tradition that 11 or 12 maidens are sacrificed to Poseidon every year to keep him happy, in the same way that Penelope's maids were sacrificed to him initially. However, this one young woman decides to try to escape. It does not work, but neither does she die. She washes up on this mysterious shore and meets another young woman who had the same thing happen to her many years before, and then strange things start to happen. And the main problem I had with this book is that it couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. It wasn't exactly a Greek myth retelling. It wasn't these young women finding each other and healing and or falling in love. It wasn't... I feel like they were mermaid-esque, but we never got many details about exactly what they were or how that worked. It then became a revenge tale. And then with the ending, it just wasn't satisfying, and it didn't clear up any of the questions that I had from the beginning. I think it could have been a really intriguing premise, but it needed to be reined in a bit more for my liking. We then hit my winter break, and I went wild. And the first book I finished was A Christmas Carol and Other Christmas Writings by Charles Dickens. I have never actually read any of Dickens's Christmas writing, so this was a really lovely surprise for me. I did really enjoy A Christmas Carol and some of the shorter pieces, but after a while they all started to get very repetitive. I could not finish, what was the other one? Not A Christmas Carol, the longer piece that came after that. The Haunted Man. I could not finish The Haunted Man. And honestly, I found it both funny and frustrating, his view on Christmas in his essays. Like, one of the first essays out of the box basically said, "It's Christmas, you should be happy. Doesn't matter if one of your children died and you're looking at the empty seat where they should be. No, other people have it worse than you. Cheer up, it's Christmas." Which is just thoroughly unhelpful and yet so emblematic of Victorian thought. And I think of Dickens himself. So, yeah, so I'm glad I read it. I will definitely keep it for A Christmas Carol, plus it is beautiful, but not exactly Holly Jolly Christmas. I then read another arc, which was A Most Agreeable Murder by Julia Seals, I think. And this was a Regency murder mystery, which I thought could be quite fun. And I honestly wasn't looking for any more out of it other than fun. However, it was trying so hard to be funny that it slipped over the line into just being utterly ridiculous most of the time. I did not find myself empathizing with the characters. The mystery took one too many turns for me. There were too many loose ends at the end. It just did not work for me. It felt like it was making fun of Regency culture rather than playing with Regency culture. In the other direction, however, I read Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater, and this was wonderful. This is the story of Dora, who, as a little girl, meets a fairy when she ventures too far into the woods. Finds out that her mother promised this fairy her firstborn child and then tricked him. Her mother has now died, however, and this fairy comes upon Dora on her own and decides, now I will take back what I am owed and steal your soul. However, her cousin enters and distracts and wounds this fairy when he's halfway through that process. So now Dora has only half a soul, which means she doesn't feel emotions quite the same way that other people do, and that her eyes are two different colors. And mainly the emotions, but also the eyes, make it rather difficult for her to really venture into society. However, when her cousin turns 18, they both go to London to come out into society, try and make a good match. And it's there that Dora meets the Lord Sourceier, who was the magician's, the magical assistant to the king in fighting Napoleon, who had his own Lord Sourceier. Romance ensues from there. There's also a sleeping plague that seems to be visiting London that the Lord Sourceier is trying to uncover and stop. And they all come together. This was almost perfect. I would have loved just a little bit more out of the epilogue, but it was so, so wonderful. I'm really excited to read the rest of the series. And at the back of this book is also the novella, The Lord Sourceier, which gives you more of his backstory as well. I'm never sure if I should be pronouncing his name Elias or Elias. But either way, we get to find out about his life, his time in the army, and becoming the Lord Sourceier. I then read the next Pages & Co. book by Anna James, which is The Treehouse Library. This is book 5 in the series, and it was just wonderful. I was a little bit worried at the beginning because these characters weren't grabbing me as much as the original 3 did, but by the end I was completely hooked as well. These are just so sweet and magical and comforting to anyone who was or is a massive book nerd. I can't tell you much about it for a number of reasons, but if you have not checked out the original series that begins with Tilly and the Book Wanderers, definitely do. I then read 2 more arcs, the first of which is one of my favorite books that I read this year, and that was Madame Restel by Jennifer Wright. And this tells the story of Madame Restel, who was a real person who worked as one of New York's most famous abortionists in the 19th century. So the end of her life was around the 1880s, but she started many decades before that. This book was incredible. First of all, how this woman was so well known and so ahead of her time in terms of recognizing that women needed options if they didn't want to start a family, if they had been raped, if they had been abused in some way, if they could not afford to have a child right now, but they had no other method of contraception. All of these things, she was writing essays about them in newspapers. She was largely self-trained and doing a far better job than any male doctor was doing in delivering babies. Not only her story, but the fact that Jennifer Wright pulls in a lot of the history around Madame Restel that was influencing her work one way or another was so fascinating and so perfectly timed. And I am usually one that hates American history. It is not my favorite place to study at all. Ironic considering I live here. The parallels to modern day are frighteningly clear. The Know-Nothing Party of the 1840s is so incredibly similar to the alt-right conservatives that you hear today. Medical practices that were making me just bristle with anger, philosophy about how women were basically considered children in adult bodies, and therefore they shouldn't have a right to their own body because they wouldn't know what to do with it anyway. I needed to take this book in several chunks because I just needed to walk away and cool down before I continued anymore, but that speaks to how powerfully it was written. And so I would recommend this to anyone, whether you are pro-life, pro-choice, just you need to read this just to hear other opinions. You can make up your own mind after that. But this was just a perfectly done book and so, so important today. She gets incredibly open and vulnerable in her epilogue, where she talks about her own fertility journey and the influence that the overturning of Roe versus Wade has had on her life as well as modern day America. I applaud Jennifer Wright because this was a perfectly done book. I then was very kindly sent a digital arc of Lex Croucher's next book. I read their first 2 books, which were Regency young adult romances that were very cute and very fun. This one, however, is very, very different, and it's called Gwen and Art Are Not in Love. I initially thought that this was an Arthurian legend retelling. However, it actually tells the story of nobility several generations after the Arthurian legends, and it's the legacy of those legends that these young people have to live up to. It's also a queer romance. Both Gwendolen, not Guinevere, and Arthur are supposed to marry each other. However, they both discover that they are both attracted to the same sex and not each other. Things go on from there. There is lots of comedy, there is political intrigue that crops up and affects all 4 of them as well as their families. It was a really intriguing premise, and I enjoyed it for that. I didn't necessarily love the way it was executed because it felt a little bit too silly, which Croucher admits in their author's note at the end, that this was written in the depths of lockdown, just slap happy silly for a number of reasons. And you definitely get that feeling when you read it as well. So that took away from it a little bit for me. There is also a lot of vomit and a lot of blood in here, which I am not great at handling. So if you are also a little squeamish about those things, maybe don't read this one. But overall, I do like Lex Croucher as an author, so I was really grateful to receive this arc, and I will gladly read any of their other books as we go forward as well. And then finally, I rounded out my reading year to 150 books, which I did not expect to reach at all. I have never read that many books in a year before, but I decided to give myself a treat of something short to bump it up to 150, which was SEO Trot by Roald Dahl. This is the first Roald Dahl book that I physically read myself. I haven't been a huge fan of a lot of his works, mainly because the films really freaked me out. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory really freaked me out. I have never read that book or its sequel. James and the Giant Peach really freaked me out, so I have never watched the whole film or read that book. I really want to see Matilda the musical, but the film from the 90s also really freaked me out when I was young. So I have never read the book either, although I think that one would appeal to me most. This one, however, seemed totally sweet and totally free of those freaky Roald Dahl elements that he likes to work in. And it's the story of these two older people who live in an apartment building, one above the other. And the older man is desperately in love with the woman who lives below him, but he's never been able to work up the courage to tell her so, or to ask her out, or to talk to her much at all, really, beyond your usual pleasantries with a neighbor. But she has this tortoise that she absolutely loves, named Alfie. She just wishes that he would grow bigger, because they're supposed to, but he's just not getting anywhere. So the old man comes up with a bit of a scheme to help her think that Alfie is growing, and thus win her heart at the same time, out of gratitude. It's very cute, it's very sweet, it's not very long, so you don't get a whole lot of their romance, and it becomes a little bit silly because of that. But yeah, it was sweet, it was cute, I'm glad I read it. I now really want to watch the film that was made of this. There was a film made a few years ago for television, I think, with Judi Dench and, was it Jim Broadbent? Might have been Jim Broadbent, playing these two characters, and I would love to see how they elongated the story a little bit for that film. I think that would actually make it perfect. So there you have it. Those are all of the books that I read in December. Let me know down below if you have any further questions or further thoughts about any of these books, and let me know what some of your favorite reads of the month were. I'll be back in a little bit to tell you more about my favorite books of the year, but that will be another day. Until then, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye, everyone.